Sounds good.
Okay, thank you for joining the podcast, Leila. Leila Nattagh is the owner and founder of the carbon consulting business W2R Solutions. Since starting W2R, Leila has been helping businesses to measure and reduce the environmental impact of their products and services. By communicating their environmental impact, Leila's work helps her clients to strengthen their messaging, build brand confidence, and gain a competitive edge in the crowded sustainability space. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Hamilton. Thanks for having me.
All right, my pleasure. So maybe we can start off with just maybe like your background, just so that the listeners know a little bit about you. Maybe, let us know how you, got your start like professionally.
Certainly. I would say my beginnings started when I was taking my bachelor's in pharmacology, which if you don't know, it's the study of drugs. And I thought I wanted to be a pharmacist or some kind of drug technician working in the lab, wearing a white lab coat. And so I was pursuing those studies. And that's when I took this class that was called toxicology, all about toxic chemicals, etc. And so the work that I was doing for a project was finding out how our everyday personal care products like shampoo, toothpaste, etc., soaps, when they end up in our waterways, when they go down the drain, how they impact the aquatic systems. And it was this huge realization for me at the time. This was back in, when was it, 2008, 2009, that our impact is huge and it's very damaging to our aquatic systems. There's a lot of hormone disrupting chemicals and it's just wreaks havoc on our little aquatic creatures. And so I thought, oh my gosh, this is horrible. Like, what can we really do here? And anyway, so that was really the initiation into our impact as humans on our natural environment. To be honest, at the time, I didn't think I could make a career out of studying the environmental system and trying to bring sustainability into the world. And so, when somebody asked me, like, what would you do with $1 million? I was like, oh, I would go back to school for sustainability. And I'm like, well, you don't need to be a millionaire to do that. It's like, oh, right, that's true. Okay, so I did my background in sustainability. I did my master's. And that's really just what, again, gave me more insight into this industry of all the problems that exist. And it was more so a way of thinking about our problems. So whether it's from the social aspects, from the biological, from the engineering side, it was a very interdisciplinary approach. And I loved it. After that, I worked at a nonprofit, worked a lot in waste management, working on different initiatives to just keep things out of the landfill, and mostly just household goods. And after that, I kind of stumbled upon this industry of measuring impact. So if a organization has some kind of novel product or some kind of novel service that has this environmental benefit, I want to help them tell that story and bring it forward and really be able to share their story in a compelling way that will attract the attention of the customers, the stakeholders, just investors and everybody else in general. So that's the space I'm at. And I do a lot of work just in basically crunching numbers and helping them to tell their story.
Yeah, no, thanks for that background. That's really awesome. And then what's the big challenge, I guess, these days? Like where are businesses, what are the biggest roadblocks for businesses that want to account for their carbon emissions?
I'd say the biggest challenge that I see is the fact that businesses know they want to do better. They want to be green. They want to be sustainable. They want to do something meaningful towards climate change and take action towards climate change, but they don't know where to begin. And so really they're not even familiar with the services that I provide and what that could mean for them, like what kind of information they can get out of my services. And so that's really the starting point of hey, we want to do good, but we don't know what we don't know. We don't know if we should start with a life cycle assessment, a carbon accounting. Should we do a waste audit? Like, they have some kind of idea of all these different terminology, but they have no idea where to begin. And it can be overwhelming. I get it. If you're not really in the space and you have a million other to-dos on your plate, it's hard to know, okay, what exactly do I need for my business, for my industry at the stage that we're at, and how do we tackle this? So it's a lot of where do we begin is the biggest challenge.
Yep, that's cool. And talk about your services too. Like, how do you help businesses?
Certainly. So I do two kinds of services mostly, and it's all about that impact measurement piece that I was talking about. So one is at a product level. So it's called a life cycle assessment or LCA. Anyways, that's quite the nerdy or technical term. But what that does is it helps to measure the carbon footprint of a product. So when you go through its entire life cycle from the moment that it was, the raw materials were produced. So let's say, for example, I do a lot of work in food and beverage industry. Let's say we're looking at oat milk. So the first stage would be, how are the oats cultivated? How are they produced? Where are they made? Or where are they produced? What happens to the oats after? So they're milled or they're transported somewhere to be milled. And we go through the entire life cycle. So basically all the way to when it becomes oat milk and it ends up in the hand of a consumer, what they do with it, and of course the end of life. So mostly in terms of the packaging, because we're drinking the milk. So it breaks it all down, and the information that the client would get is basically what is our biggest source of emissions, like where do we need to focus on if we want to reduce our emissions? How does it compare to other types of milks out there? Like, how does it compare to traditional cow's milk or almond milk, etc.? So they would have that kind of information, and then also know how they can make changes within their supply chain, within their ingredients, etc., to basically have a more sustainable product that does less harm. So that's at a product level, and it's called life cycle assessment. On an organizational level, it's called carbon accounting. And so this you might have heard in the news recently. So there's a lot of talk about the SEC, the US SEC, the Securities and Exchanges Commission, wanting to mandate scope 1, 2, 3 emission reporting for publicly traded companies. And so scope 1, 2, 3 is really different types of emissions that any company would emit. Some of them are direct through the operations that they have. So whether they have facilities, vehicles, etc., and some of them are indirect through their supply chain. And so that can be because they're transporting goods from a supplier, they're transporting goods to a vendor or a client. So it gets really, really in depth. And so there's a lot of work to measure those emissions. So, but basically when you do the work, it kind of tells you the same thing as a life cycle assessment. It tells you those hot spots. Where are the areas of opportunities if you want to reduce your emissions? And it just tells you your overall emissions. So if you're wanting to work towards carbon neutrality or net zero, then you know what you need to do. So there are going to be some emissions that can be reduced and some that just cannot be reduced because they're pertinent to your operations. But it gives you that information basically at a snapshot.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And then what about like individuals? Do you have any advice on how individuals can maybe like have a lower carbon footprint?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I haven't really worked much with individuals, but I did do a project where we're helping individuals to measure their impact and create meaningful ways in which they can reduce their impact. So usually for individual impact, it's like a 3-part breakdown. So about a third of our emissions come from transportation. So whether it's the cars we drive, the flights that we take, et cetera. Another third is coming from the food and the goods that we purchase. So what kind of diet you're on, or like how often you shop. And then the other third is just about your home utilities. So like basically how much energy you use to heat and cool your home. So if you want to take an action in each one of those categories, that would make sense. So, in terms of food and products, I think that's usually the one that comes up more in conversations, trying to reduce our meat consumption. Sometimes you can't rule it out completely, but trying to reduce our meat consumption, just shopping local as much as we can also make a huge difference. And in terms of products, I think the most sustainable product, as much as I do LCAs and help others to talk about the products, the most sustainable product is the one that's already been made. So if we can reuse the product that's already has been made through thrift shopping or just buying reused stuff, that's going to make a lot of difference. And of course, in terms of transportation, having no car is going to make a lot of impact, but reducing our aviation or just getting on an airplane, that's going to make a lot of impact. But again, that may not be feasible depending on where you are and what your lifestyle is like. So yeah, there's a lot of different things that can be done at a personal level, but it really just needs to align with your values and your budget and really just what's feasible for your family as well.
And you've done work in the fashion space. Can you talk a little bit how you help fashion companies and what are maybe some of the easy wins that they get in terms of the work?
Yeah, I have done work in the fashion space, and it's quite fascinating, to be honest. Everything about it. So I have done work in terms of a lot towards the back end, not really the back end, but the end of life, if you will. So once your products reach the end of life, you drop it off at a charity like Goodwill, et cetera, what happens to it at that point? So I'm quite familiar with that world. But in terms of, any new fashion designer and the products that they create, there's a lot. So some of the work, like the biggest sources of emissions when it comes to clothing or apparel is really the material itself, and it also depends on how the material is made. And this is where there's a lot of trade-offs to be made, and there's no answer in terms of what is the most sustainable fabric out there. Cotton, yes, it is a natural product that does not shed any microfibers, and it's great that way, but the cultivation of cotton does require a lot of water, and it does require a lot of pesticide use as well. So there's that trade-off of, okay, do we want to have clean water with less microplastics, or do we want to use more water to grow this cotton and use a lot of toxic pesticides and fertilizers at the same time? So there's a lot of trade-offs. And again, this work kind of goes back to what the client really cares about. And so some of the wins that I've seen, so for example, I just finished a project where I was helping a company who makes these fire retardant jackets, mostly for the workers within utility companies. So the oil and gas companies who are just out in the field and they need to be protected. They wear certain material, it's aramide materials that is, basically fire retardant, or fire resistant. And because of the chemical structure of the aramides, they can actually be recycled for a number of times without losing the quality, which is fantastic. You can't get the same for cotton. Cotton, they can be recycled once because the fibers get shorter and they lose their quality and they basically become useless. But aramides, you can recycle them. So some of the work that I just finished was just looking at, okay, if we were to make jackets with a certain percentage of recycled content, what does that do for the carbon footprint? Like how much does it go down per percentage of recycled content? So that was actually really interesting. And so the client was interested in this work because they're selling this product at a premium to these utility companies, and they want to say, hey, this is the impact we're creating because now it has recycled content. We're making jobs locally because we're shredding it locally, we're creating it locally, et cetera. It doesn't have to come overseas. But also there is also an environmental benefit here, and this is exactly what it looks like. So it just helps them to validate their claims. and helps them to justify the premium of this new product that they have.
Yeah, that's cool. And then what type of, I guess from just like fashion companies are normally really like it's on the high end, I guess, of the pollution scale. And there's a lot that is, you know, in the news, like we're, you know, there's different companies that we're trying to do different things. What type of patterns do you see, I guess, when it comes to these companies in terms of like, where are they willing to invest to make a change? Like, do you find that happens more on kind of like the services side? Is it hiring or working with, you know, different textiles, like making more investments in more innovative materials? Have you seen any patterns in terms of like where maybe some of the larger companies are focusing their attention when it comes to like, you know, working in this space?
Good question. And I've seen all kinds of initiatives within the apparel space. And I think it just comes down to sometimes they're informed decisions, and sometimes they are decisions that are because of consumer pressure. So again, like going back to the entire life cycle of a product, like if we're looking at a t-shirt, the most impact is coming from, you know, how the t-shirt is made. But if the brand is getting a lot of pressure from the customers saying like, hey, why do you keep putting this t-shirt in a plastic bag? They might be like just wanting to target the packaging side of it and making that more sustainable. So whether it's a compostable, returnable, some kind of packaging to satisfy the needs of their end consumers. But really, if you look at the entire life cycle, I think that packaging may contribute like 4% to the overall carbon footprint. But it does reduce our waste production. So again, it's just this question of what is the offset that we're talking about and what makes sense for the brand at the time. The other piece that is usually left out of the conversation is just that use piece as well. So how the consumer washes and dries the clothes can make a lot of impact, especially if we consider how long they're going to wear this product. So how long is it even going to last for realistically? And that's one of the problems with fast fashion. If they're one time or two time wear within a season, then it's really not, it doesn't matter like what it's made out of if you can't wear it for long periods of time. So anyways, so if we can make them last as long as possible and help the consumer to make better decisions when it comes to laundering their clothes, I think that's going to go a long way as well. And just having options for the end of life of that product as well. And so again, that's why I'm kind of against fast fashion, because they're trendy. And so once the season is done, you kind of don't wear the clothes anymore. So try to go for the timeless clothes that you can wear again and again. And you know, accessorize with whatever is in fashion at the time. But yeah, I think it's just a matter of responding to consumer demand versus making informed decisions based on the life cycle analysis or other kind of information that they have, where they can actually target those hotspots that are true for their product specifically.
That's great. And what about like from the customer standpoint, like what has made customers be more vocal about the products that they buy, like wanting more from the companies and stuff? Like, where do you see that? What is like the big thing that has made that more important to customers? Because it wasn't always like top of mind.
It wasn't. Yeah, it definitely wasn't. And it's nice to see that we're all more aware of climate change and this environmental crisis that we're in, and we're putting that pressure on the brands that we support or that we want to support, and asking them what they're doing. And I think a lot of that is just coming from this, basically social media. It's just the fact that we can share information more easily, we can be in the know of who's doing what, or what they're not doing or what they're not doing well. But I think at the same time, it can be a little bit dangerous too, because once a narrative is out there and everyone has kind of accepted it, it's hard to go back and kind of change people's minds. And so the example that I think of is single-use plastics. And again, it goes back to the question of like, what are you, what are the offsets and what are you, offsets. I'm thinking of trade-offs. Like, what are the trade-offs here? So with single-use plastics, like, yes, we're trying to reduce generation of pollution, and we're trying to make sure that it doesn't end up in our precious environment. But at the same time, plastics do actually have a smaller carbon footprint than their alternatives. So it's actually better than glass. Like, it doesn't break as much, doesn't take as much resources to produce or recycle. They're lighter in transportation, so we don't need to use as much fuel to transport, let's say, milk in plastic jugs versus milk in glass jugs. So the danger in creating this narrative about single-use plastics, saying how bad it is can kind of work against us if we're also trying to target emissions at the same time. So I think it's great that we have access to this information. We can easily share information, but at the same time, I think a lot of the narrative and a lot of the context can also get lost just because there's so much to know. Like, it's not a simple, straightforward answer of yes, plastic is bad. I think plastic has really helped us get pretty far in our lives so far as humanity. But yeah, there's better ways of managing it, of course, at the end of his life. So anyways, I guess my answer is that the narrative can be too simplified and one-sided, and it needs to be broadened.
No, that's really powerful. I'm kind of picturing an infographic with like a plastic bottle of milk and a glass bottle of milk, and like the emissions that it would take for the glass. That would probably get a lot of retweets or pins or or a lot of people up in uproar to some,
yes,
to one side or the other. What about your top 3 brands that you think maybe are doing it well? It could be a fashion brand, it could be CPG brand, it could be any kind of brand. But like, what are some, like, maybe your top 3 and why? Why do you think they're doing well for the environment?
Yeah, I'd say Patagonia is definitely up there as an apparel brand. I kind of love everything about them. I love the fact that they make their clothes to last. So really, you can have them last like 10, 20 years, for their jackets, etc. They actually take care of it at the, if something goes wrong with it, they will repair it if you get a hole or a rip in your jacket. And I love that. I love that idea. And of course, I think a lot of people look at it and say, well, that's just not good for the bottom line, because that's an opportunity for you to sell one more jacket. But they're really sticking to their values and say, hey, listen, if our clients really care about the environment and we're showing them that we also care for the environment by actually fixing your products instead of asking you to come in and get a new one, then I think we all win. And just operating with those values, I think that goes a long way. And, everything that they've done, like, trying to limit branding of their t-shirts, because people don't really like to wear other people's brands on their t-shirts and like be this walk-in advertisement. Like, there's just so many things that they're doing that is right. Yeah, and I love them for it. I would say Ben & Jerry's is pretty cool too. And I like that they also just live their values. I think they put out a CSR report back in I forget, I want to say 85, maybe it was 90, but just way before anybody was actually doing this work. And just everything that they communicate in terms of Black Lives Matter, and just all of their, yeah, just their philosophy of what's going on in the world at the time. I think that makes a big difference. Like, they're not here just making ice cream and that's it, go home and eat it, but they're actually standing for something. And that, again, I just love that as a consumer, be it a very biased and sustainable focused consumer. My third brand, that's a good question. I think anybody who is selling things that are used, so whether it's clothing, whether it's furniture, anybody who's in that reuse space has got my vote for sure, just because I like finding things that are unique that nobody else can find. So whether, it's home goods or clothing, and it's just way better for the environment in any way that you can imagine, whether it's the manufacturing, the transportation, etc. I think that's really the way to go.
That's great. And where do you get your information? What are some good podcast recommendations? Maybe some blogs, or something else that maybe listeners should check up on or read up on?
Yeah, there's a lot. In terms of articles, it's usually New York Times or New Yorker. In terms of blogs, there's a couple that I usually check out. Some of them are very specific to what I do. So there's one consulting firm whose name is escaping me right now. Oh my gosh. EcoChain. Yeah, EcoChain. I love their blogs because they break down very complex ideas when it comes to doing, life cycle assessments or carbon accounting, like basically my services, but they break it down into a very simplified way, in a simplified way. And I love that. So that's usually where I point my clients to, and perhaps I should kind of duplicate what they do for myself. But I love how they break it down. In terms of other blogs, there is a platform for carbon offsets called patch.io. And again, they just have a lot of information within the industry of carbon offsets, which I'm just learning a little bit more about these days. And I just like hearing their perspective on this industry. And I think the rest of the information that I get is just within my network on LinkedIn. I kind of live on LinkedIn these days. So I have a few people that I follow, and everything that they post, I just love to follow up on and read on. So that's usually where I get most of my information from.
Perfect. What about some good book recommendations?
So the one book that I usually recommend to anyone who's interested in carbon footprinting is Why Bananas Are Bad. There is a new book that I just started, Net Positive. I forget the author's name. And the other one that I read that, it's just kind of like a starter to climate change, is How to Avoid a Climate Disaster by Bill Gates. So that's probably one of my favorites too. And again, I just like how he breaks it down into in a simplified way. And of course, there's another one called We Are the Weather. And I like the perspective of how do we make, collective change or collective differences, like behavioral change, I guess. So that's also an interesting one that I'd recommend for others to read.
Yeah, that's great. No, thank you so much for doing this. I want to, make this available to you. Also, just if you have anywhere that you would like for listeners to reach out to you, for information. I know you've got like a webinar coming up. Maybe talk about some of the places where we can find you, and then how we can work with you too.
Of course, definitely. So the best way to find me is on LinkedIn by searching my name. I think my I'm not even sure what it's called, but the end handle of my LinkedIn is CO2 consultant. Anyways, if you just look up my name, you'll be able to find me on LinkedIn. And I do have regular webinars through my website, so you can also find them. And my link is www.w2 as in the number 2, R as in Robert Solutions with an S at the end.com. And if you sign up for my newsletter, then you can keep in touch, with everything that I send out. It's only like a couple of times a month email, but you also hear about my newsletter. So my next, you also hear about my webinars. Sorry. So my next webinar is August 11th, but I'll have ones coming up after that pretty regularly, like once every couple months or so. So you can be sure to catch the next one. But yeah, LinkedIn is definitely where you can find a little bit more about me and check out my content. I try to post regularly as well. So I'd be happy to connect with anyone on there.
That's great. And what can they expect on the webinar?
Good question. So the webinar is going to cover carbon accounting. Basically, what is it? What information do you get out of it? Why do you need it? And also, what does it mean for the clients? Like how much time is it going to be on their end? What they're going to get out of it as well. So it's really just a breakdown of that work. And I'll also share basically past wins for clients that have done this work. And I'll also have an offer to share as well if anyone would be interested in taking the next steps.
It's awesome. Well, this has been a real treat. I really appreciate all the gems, and we'll sign off. Thanks again.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. Take care.